The United States helped the Allies to victory during World War I, and a big part of this help was thanks to the lethal battleships used by the US Navy. Stick around to find out this and more. The first of these ships, and one of the most iconic of them, is the Florida Class battleship. A class made of two ships, Florida and Utah, these battleships were basically the model for every other US-made dreadnought. Designed based on close observation and foreign designs, the Floridas were designed to be larger than the previous classes of battleships and more protected than their British counterparts. Both Florida-class ships were about 510 feet long at the waterline, with a wide beam that allowed them to carry larger medium-caliber guns than previous models of battleships. While Florida was designed to have a larger bridge to accommodate the crew of 1,001 officers, one of the Utah's best features was its heavily armored fire control tower. Originally, both Florida-class battleships were propelled by 4-shaft Parsons steam turbines before being replaced with 4 White Foster oil-fired boilers after the First World War. Both ships were intended to carry 8 14-inch 45 caliber guns, but had to settle for the more common 10 12-inch 45 caliber Mark V guns in 5 twin gun turrets, which could shoot 2 to 3 rounds per minute. The Floridas had the same turret layout as the Delaware-class ships that came before them, but also had new 5-inch 51 caliber guns for increased splinter protection. Lastly, for these battleships, both had armored belts with thickness ranging from 9 to 11 inches. The case-mated guns with between 8 and 10 inches of armor plate were moved to the ship's superstructure, making it more protected than the majority of battleships made in the early 1900s. Florida was dispatched to Europe just months after the United States joined the war in 1917. She was assigned to the 6th Battle Squadron of the British Grand Fleet in the North Sea, and sailed there until the war ended, when she escorted President Woodrow Wilson on his trip to Europe to participate in the peace negotiations at Versailles. Florida continued to serve mostly for diplomatic trips around the Caribbean and South America, until being decommissioned in February 1931. Utah, on the other hand, wasn't part of the British Grand Fleet, but she also saw frontline duty in the war before being sent to Bantry Bay, Ireland, to base as a convoy escort ship on the approach to Europe in the ending months of the war. She would also be decommissioned and broken apart in 1931, just like her sister ship. But the role of the 2 Florida ships in World War I cannot be forgotten. The same can be said about these next ships, the O'Brien-class destroyers. Although launched in April 1914 at the very start of the war, the 6 battleships in this class operated solely in the Atlantic or Caribbean for 3 years. When the United States made her entrance into World War I in April 1917, however, all 6 were immediately sent to Queenstown, Ireland, for convoy duties. The 6 O'Brien battleships, namely O'Brien, Nicholson, Winslow, McDougall, Eckerson, and Cushing, are remembered for the countless passengers and crew they saved from ships that had been sunk by U-boats. In fact, Nicholson became the first US Navy ship to sink a German U-boat when it sank the U-58 in November 1917. So yeah, these ships were used for a lot of rescuing missions, but they were more than capable of causing damage themselves. That explains why the O'Brien class was known as a 1,000-tonner, seeing they were the 3rd of the 5 classes of the US destroyers with over 1,000 long tons displacement. Having overall length of 305 feet 5 inches, they were smaller than the Florida-class battleships. However, what they lacked in size, they definitely made up for in speed thanks to the unique increased torpedo size, which was a full 3 inches more than that of the preceding class's 18-inch torpedoes. They were also 2 direct drive steam turbines and geared ones for 15 knots cruising, which improved the speed of the O'Briens. All 6 destroyers except Cushing were equipped with supplemental triple expansion reciprocating engines for cruising. O'Brien, Nicholson, and Winslow had 2 each. McDougall and Erickson both had 1. Cushing, however, was equipped with a pair of geared steam turbines for cruising rather than the reciprocating engines. For every member of the class, the primary battery during the war consisted of 4-inch 50 Mark IX guns, which fired 33-pound armor-piercing projectiles at 880 meters per second, which was pretty impressive for destroyers of that era. Every member was also equipped with depth charges throughout their service during the war, although the US Navy General Board requested that the O'Brien class be fitted with 2 anti-aircraft guns. The original models of these destroyers never had these weapons. After the war, All 6 ships were returned to the US and decommissioned 3 years later, although Erickson and McDougall were recommissioned to serve in the United States Coast Guard in 1924. All 6 ships would eventually be sold for scrapping in the decade that followed. As efficient as the O'Brien-class destroyers were, they'd always be outmatched by the next class of World War I ships, the Sampson-class destroyers. USS Sampson, USS Rowan, USS Davis, USS Allen, USS Wilkes, and USS Shaw. These were the final ships of the 26,000-tonner destroyers. And we have to say, the Navy really kept the best for last with this class of destroyers. Not only were the Sampsons the largest and most heavily armored of the 1,000-tonners, but they were also the first ever US destroyer class to mount anti-aircraft guns, 2 1-pounder 37mm autocannons. During the war, these 6 ships also had anti-submarine armaments added, as well as a single depth charge track and a Y-gun depth charge protector. And there's more. The general gun armament for destroyers of this period was also amped up for the Sampsons. They had torpedo armaments of 12 21-inch torpedo tubes, replacing the 4 twin mounts of the preceding class with 4 triple mounts. In fact, the gun and torpedo armament designs for these ships became the standard for the mass production flush deck Wicks and Clemson classes, which were commissioned after the war. These destroyers had a bigger torpedo armament, which used broadside rather than central line torpedo tubes, making it possible for the ship to have some torpedoes remaining after firing a broadside. To achieve this, the Mark 8 torpedo was used for this class of ships. Because of how efficient and well-equipped the Sampson class was, they were made to serve in the First World War only just months after being constructed, and they did not disappoint. USS Sampson, for one, was successful in protecting route transports and merchant ship convoys from Imperial German Navy submarines while serving with the United States Naval Forces operating in European waters. She also successfully answered many distress calls before the end of the war, including rescuing 2 small boatloads of survivors of steamer English Monarch and rescuing the captain and 13 sailors from the steamer Alele. Her sister ships also recorded similar important outings at sea, like USS Davis getting involved in the open fire attack between the destroyers USS Paulding and USS Trippe, and German submarine HMS L2 in February 1918 in the Atlantic Ocean off the south coast of Ireland. Even USS Wilkes, who was deployed to serve as a convoy shepherd at Brest and Saint Nazaire, France, was renowned for her ability to go through stormy Atlantic days despite having very short time in port. It's really no surprise that one of the 6, the USS Allen, was still able to serve in the Pearl Harbor Defensive Sea era through World War II, before being decommissioned at Philadelphia in October 1945. A conversation about the US Navy ships that were used during World War I won't be complete without mentioning the famous Caldwell Class destroyers. To put it simply, the 6 ships of the Caldwell Class were the forerunners of most of the successful destroyers used by the US Navy during the war after the Sampsons. These 6 were actually the first of 279 ordered to a flush-decked design, when the Navy sought to remove the forecastle brake weakness of the 1,000-tonners. While they were admittedly a tiny bit slower than the Wicks and Clemson class vessels of the early 1920s, the Caldwell class, launched in 1916, was an improvement of everything destroyers were known to be at the time. They had a better forward sheer to prevent constant washing out of the mount, and had their broadside 4-inch guns relocated to the bandstands aft of the bridge, which helped to keep the mounts dry. Caldwells also had their middle stack wider than their predecessors, as their boiler uptakes were a combination of 2 single uptakes. The success of these designs in mass production destroyers is why they are known as flush deck or 4-stack destroyers. Of the 6 ships in this class, Caldwell, Craven, and Manly were built with 4 funnels, while the other 3, Gwyn, Connor, and Stockton, had only 3. All 6 destroyers had a larger torpedo armament, with 12 21-inch torpedo tubes, and were equipped with Mark 8 torpedoes. Each ship carried a 3-inch 23 caliber anti-aircraft gun, just aft of the bow 4-inch gun. It's important to note, though, that as efficient as these may have been, the original design for the Caldwell class was for 2 1-pound AA guns. The only reason the 3-inch guns were used was the short supply at the time. Remember, they were constructed in 1916, during the war, so there wasn't exactly time to wait for unavailable armament. This low supply actually resulted in only 4 of the 6 Caldwell ships being able to serve during the war. Caldwell, Stockton, Connor, and Manly served as convoy escorts in the Atlantic during the war, while the others never got finished on time to join the battle. So far, we've only considered classes of battleships that took part in the First World War, but this last mention is a single ship so impactful, we have to include it in this video. The USS New York, or as she was known during the war, the USS Saratoga. We're not talking about the Lady Sarah, the more famous aircraft carrier with the same name which served in the Second World War. The Saratoga that served in the First World War was the first American armored cruiser ever built. She was originally built in Cramp, New York, way back in the 1890s as a radical departure from the USS Maine. She was the sleeker, faster, and more protected version of every cruiser ever made for the US Navy before her. This ship also had lighter armament, with only 8-inch guns, making her best suited for distant stations, although she could serve as a battleship. After taking an active part in the War of 1898, the Russo-Japanese War, and touring the world on numerous outings, New York was extensively renovated and refitted between 1905 and 1909. Her main guns and turrets were replaced with 4 more lethal 8-inch 45 caliber Mark VI guns in new Mark 12 turrets. Her side 8-inch guns and torpedo tubes were removed, as well as her secondary armament. The latter was replaced with 10 5-inch 50 caliber Mark VI guns and 8 3-inch 50 caliber guns. Even her turrets and barbettes were refitted to have improved Krupp cemented armor. New York also got equipped with 12 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, and the funnels, which were extended with the aim of improving natural draft through the boilers. After getting this full-on makeover, it was only right that she was renamed to Saratoga in February 1911, after which she spent the next 5 years in the Far East and as part of the Pacific Reserve Fleet. When the US joined the World War in 1917, Saratoga was deployed with the Pacific Patrol Force to patrol the Mexican coast before later joining the Cruiser Force Atlantic Fleet. While in Mexico, Saratoga helped capture a merchantman transporting 32 German agents and several Americans seeking to avoid the draft law. Amidst the war, she got refitted again, this time with 3 2-inch 50 anti-aircraft guns replacing her 5-inch and 3-inch caliber guns. If there ever was a ship deserving of the title Old But Gold, it was the USS Saratoga. After the war, she was renamed Rochester, the name under which she served until she was scuttled in 1941. Which of these ships do you think is the most impressive? Let us know in the comments section, and enjoy our other videos.